region, particularly when we talk about sustainable infrastructure. So with that, he was first elected in 2011 and was reelected in 2015 and 2019. He has taken on several leadership roles within Loudoun County and throughout the Washington region. And I hope you took an opportunity to read the slides when I had him going during lunch, because that really had contained all his bio. And I think the only thing I didn't put up there, and I will just mention here, is that he, in his professional capacity, Matt is Managing Director of Communications and Media for Global Energy Institute at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. He previously served as a senior aide in the United States Senate. And the most important fact is that he does live in Dulles South with his family and 4 children. With that, Supervisor Letourneau, please come on up.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will always call Scott York Mr. Chairman.
Please.
Absolutely. Because I would be where I am now without Scott and the work that we did together in 2011 to bring some change to Loudoun County. And a lot of what we did in those first 4 years was really the groundwork for what the county's been able to do since then. So this is a lunch. My aim today is to tell you all about Metro, a little bit about the challenges we're facing, and not make you sick, because we just had a delicious lunch. But maybe I'll just start for a moment on how the Metro Board is set up, because some folks don't know. There's 8 of us that serve as principal directors on the Metro Board. We also have 8 alternates. Supervisor Alcorn is my alternate and my very good friend. There's 2 of us from Virginia. 1 of us is appointed by the governor, the other appointed by the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission. So that is made up of the elected officials from Fairfax County, Arlington County, Alexandria, City of Falls Church, City of Fairfax, and of course us in Loudoun County. I am that representative. So I am the representative for all the local governments in Northern Virginia. And then we have 2 from the state of Maryland. We have 2 from the district. One's appointed by the mayor, one by the council traditionally. And then we have 2 federal representatives, which change with every presidential administration. We have a very good group on our board. Before I came on the board, which was in February of 2020, I actually went to 1 in-person meeting, and then we had this COVID-19 thing. And the whole world changed, and the transit industry changed, and we'll get into that. But prior to my being on the board, there were some things about the Metro Board that you may have heard that were not so positive. There were some issues with ethics and those kind of things, and the previous chairman. That's way in the past. We have a great collaborative group that work together very closely. And probably the most important thing any board can do is make sure we have a good staff. And so the most significant thing that happened in Metro, as you all know, is the change in leadership we had with Randy Clark coming on board, coming to us from Austin, Texas. And we were very deliberate with who we hired for this position. We wanted somebody with a lot of energy. We wanted somebody who would not get discouraged, because this is an incredibly challenging job. We wanted somebody who could motivate people, who really could get into our workforce, because at the end of the day, when you have 12,000 employees, if it only takes 1 that's not bought in at the wrong time, and you've got yourself a really serious problem. And I believe with Randy, we found that person. We found somebody who came in on day 1 with a very clear vision. He worked very closely with the board to establish a strategic plan, and not just one that's going to sit on paper, but one that really is the North Star for the organization. And so in just 1 year, you can see on the screen sort of what happened. Now, admittedly, he came in at a time where a lot of our 7,000 series rail fleet was sitting in our shop yards because of a derailment issue. But we worked through that, and we actually got those trains back. We obviously had the Silver Line opening, which is incredibly exciting. We also had an opening in Alexandria at Potomac Yards station. The thing that I'm most focused on here, though, is actually that 16%, because that is the percentage increase in customer satisfaction from our customers. At the end of the day, that's what we care the most about. So people who are using Metro are much more satisfied with it because it's more reliable, it's safer, and it's more frequent. And that's not rocket science, but it's easier said than done. And to think how far we've come in just a year really is remarkable. So we are currently in fiscal year 24, and the board worked closely with management on several initiatives. As I mentioned, we've increased our bus and our rail services. We changed our fare structure. It's still not the most simple fare structure. The number one question I get is, why can't we have a flat fare like New York City? It's actually federal law. It would be almost impossible to go back and do that because of the analysis that has to take place. You can't have disparate impact on different incomes and racial groups and things like that. So you couldn't do that today if you tried to retroactively back your way into it. But we did try to simplify our system quite a bit. Our fare system. We have a new low-income fare program. If you are eligible for services where you live, you get a discount with Metro now. We capped how much our Metro access trips cost. We have a better bus initiative underway in which we literally are doing a clean sheet design of our entire bus system. We had a whole lot of legacy bus routes that have been in place for a long time because some member of the DC Council wanted one somewhere. That's not the most efficient way to run a system, so we're fixing that. We do have zero emission buses that are coming on board. We have moved forward with our next round of rail cars, our 8000 series, and we had several new bus initiatives. The biggest thing is level of service. Really interesting fact. Metro at this moment is running more train service than at any time in our entire history, the 47-year history of Metro. We've increased service 11 times since the summer of 2022, and ridership is coming back. Certainly the world has changed, and we all know that. It changed for me. I have another job. I don't go into DC every day anymore the way I used to. So Metro has had to change the way that we think and the way that we approach our service. This system was built basically to serve federal workers who work from 9 to 5, traveling from outside the district, inside the district. That's no longer the region we have. We have a heck of a lot of reverse commuting, and I believe in the future we'll have even more. We have people going at different hours of the day. We have people going into the office for a meeting or an afternoon, but not necessarily the whole day. And then, because more people are home, one of the really interesting ridership trends that we saw right away coming out of the pandemic was we saw a huge surge in weekend ridership. People actually want to get out more. They want to do things. They want to go to the district. They want to go to a concert or a sports game. So we've had to change the way that we offer service, change our frequencies, change really our whole model in order to do that. And so right now there are 60% more daily trips being taken than at this time last year. And the service increases have been spread around all of our system, different times and targeted in different ways, but trying to be strategic about how we're growing. The Silver Line. So obviously a great point of pride for all of us here. There are a series of debates going on in Loudoun County because we have an election coming up in a few weeks, including mine. And the first two debates have happened. And in each debate, the candidates for the Catoctin and Little River District were asked the question by the moderator, was the Silver Line a mistake? Was it a mistake to build the Silver Line? Because it doesn't seem like it's being utilized all that often. Well, actually, the 6 new stations on the Silver Line are seeing about 35,000 trips per week. That's a lot of cars off the road. That's a lot of people who are using the Silver Line. Dulles Airport and the Ashburn station are the busiest stations, not surprising, end of the line station as well as the airport. 60% of the entries are coming at peak period, which means that those are people who would be traveling during the period of highest congestion on the roads. And the customers who are getting on at those new stations are most typically traveling to destinations along the Silver Line or to downtown DC. So the bottom line is, it is getting used. We've seen continuing increases What this translates to at the Ashburn station, for instance, is somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 entries a day, unique entries a day. And there's really not a lot of development around those stations at this point, which I think will change as time comes. So the Silver Line thus far has been a success. I will share that I believe shortly, in the next several weeks, we will approach our 1 millionth passenger at the Dulles Airport Station. So that's pretty exciting. About 40% of the entries on the Silver Line are at Dulles. The ridership trend is typically heaviest in the early afternoon, highest number of entries and exits between 2 o'clock and 6 o'clock. And some of that's when a lot of international flights are both arriving and then passengers are getting to the airport to depart. The weekend share of overall ridership at Dulles is higher than the system-wide average. So that means people are using the airport. We've had discussions about how we can more effectively serve Dulles Airport. One of our challenges is that our system opens relatively late for workers. And so that's a conversation we've had with the airport's authority about whether there is some demand that we can serve potentially earlier on certain lines. And I think as we go forward, as we look at Metro into the future, it's part of our strategic plan to take a close look at how we're serving those customers. But overall, I've been pretty pleased with what's happened along the Silver Line. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of development that's going to occur. The Board of Supervisors in Loudoun County approved a mixed-use project called Ravana Mid-Innovation Station. It's really the next Reston, and it will be in the 28 corridor serving that station. So we're just getting started. This is a very, very long-term project and investment, but so far so good. So how important is Metro to the Washington region? Within a half a mile of a Metro rail station, 60% of the population in the entire region, 2.8 million people, live within a half a mile of a Metro station. 70% of the jobs in the region are within a half a mile of a Metro rail station. 50% of employers, which translates to 34,000 businesses. The really interesting thing is when you look at how much land that actually is, it's only 3% of the land mass of this region. So 3% of our land mass is serving that many people and responsible for that many jobs. 30% of the property value, it's worth more money than most of the region is, and so on and so forth. I won't read all of those statistics, but gives you a pretty clear picture of what the growth pattern has been in the Washington region over a long period of time and where it's going and why it is so critical that we have a functioning metro system, because all of this planning, decades of land use, decades of investment, private investment, have all been baked into having metro accessible to them. Okay, that's all the good news. Now let's start talking about the more difficult news, which is that we do have a fiscal cliff. We have a significant funding crisis. And I'll spend some time talking a little bit about how we got to that point. But the most immediate thing is when transit ridership dropped during COVID, and it did drop dramatically during the peak of COVID, we were seeing something like 10% of our normal ridership and fare revenue. The federal government stepped in and provided transit agencies around the country with relief. One of the caveats of that relief is that we have to use it and you can't lay anybody off. So one of the questions I get from business people is usually, well, if you've known there's a fiscal cliff coming, why haven't you sort of started easing into it and started making choices and things like that? Well, as long as we're using that federal money, we can't actually do that. We have to maintain our full employment. And in fact, we don't want to do that because we're growing and we're bringing people back and we do have new service and we have a lot of vacant positions that we're filling. So the problem is that federal relief will run out, and it will run out next year. And when it does, we don't have an easy way to make up that revenue. Metro, ultimately, as you can see from the bottom part of the table there, the majority of the money that we have is coming from state and local subsidies. Those things work differently in different places. In Maryland, the state of Maryland basically covers the entire amount that the localities would owe. In Virginia, we split that. So the Commonwealth of Virginia provides about half, but the local governments also provide about half. And so each of our jurisdictions, as part of our operating budgets in Loudoun County and elsewhere, we're providing Metro with subsidies. They vary. Loudoun County opted out of Metro Bus, therefore we don't pay for capital and for operating associated with Metro Bus. But, in especially our larger metro jurisdictions, it is a significant amount of money, and you can kind of see how it's projected out. All that said, the COVID situation and federal funding situation really just accelerated something that was kind of baked into the financial model of Metro, which has never been sustainable. And in fact, if you've heard Randy Clark speak before, you've heard him say that, sitting on his desk from the first day was a report commissioned by some outside group at the start of Metro saying that the financial model wasn't sustainable. We're relying on annual operations from a whole series of governments. We're the only transit agency in North America and probably the world that doesn't have a dedicated revenue stream. In most other places, there's a particular tax or there's a particular fee or whatever it is that just flows into the transit agency. We don't have that. We also have a 3% cap in our annual expenditure growth, which is legislation that was passed by the General Assembly in 2018 when capital was funded. So when you put those things together, you think about a 3% cap, you think about what inflation has been in the United States for the last several years, you can understand why the fiscal cliff has accelerated for Metro. But digging a little deeper into what the drivers are of our deficit, which is $750 million, inflation and collective bargaining is down there at the bottom. So we have a heavily unionized workforce. We are subject to federal law. We go to binding arbitration. The contracts at Metro dictate through arbitration that we had to increase salaries for WMATA employees commensurate with the cost of living over the last several years. So that resulted in wage increases between 6 and 10%, several years in a row. There is no government that you all live in that did that, and most private employers didn't do that. But Metro had to do it. So that's that $266 million that expanded. Jurisdictional subsidy credit. So basically, during the height of the pandemic, in order to be good regional partners, at a time when there was great uncertainty for all of our governments, Metro actually reduced the amount of subsidy we were asking for from our jurisdictions. And we did that because very few people were using it, and we didn't know what the long-term fiscal health of any government was going to be at that time. We didn't know if businesses were going to come back, we didn't know if tax revenue was going to come back, we didn't know what the impact on home values and property values was going to be. So Metro relieved subsidy to the tune of $196 million several years ago. We'll kind of put a pin in that and come back to it in a second. And then decreased revenue since the pandemic is $288 million of this deficit. That's simply reduced ridership. That's ridership that did not occur during the pandemic, revenue that we would have received that we didn't receive. So how do we balance this budget? The only real tool that we have is labor costs. Labor costs are over 70% of our budget. A lot of our system has fixed costs. So whether you're running one train an hour or whether you're running a 10, you have to have track, you have to have rail inspectors, you have to have operators, you have to have controllers. We have numerous regulatory bodies that oversee us from the safety side, so you have to pay for all of that. Our fixed costs, especially on rail, are very high. It's not very expandable. Cutting service doesn't result in huge reductions on rail, especially. But it's really the only tool that we have to balance our budget. We have to have a balanced budget. So what would we have to do if we don't figure out a way to move forward? We're going to have to decrease service, quality of service, accessibility, and so on. What that $750 million deficit translates into is essentially laying off 5,300 employees, about 40% of our workforce, with a commensurate ridership impact reduction of about 95 million people. And you can see what we save on the expense. Now, On the revenue side, not surprisingly, we take a hit, right? Because if you're reducing ridership at this point, you have this many fewer riders, you're not going to collect as much revenue either. So this is not an easy deficit to close, and the tools that Metro has at its own disposal are quite limited. I mentioned the $196 million in subsidy foregone. Well, what that did was essentially reset the base level of subsidy. And so when we did start collecting the 3% increase again, it was at a lower level. When you compound that across all of our jurisdictions and over 4 fiscal years, that's $690 million in foregone subsidy. Because in 1 year during COVID, we provided relief. So that has obviously a significant impact, and that's a big chunk of the reason why we're in this situation right now when we're in. Okay, so I talked a little bit about the ways we can reduce deficit. Fares is one place, and we're working on fares. The truth is, when you run financial models on fare increases, they don't typically produce a lot of revenue, because the higher you increase fare, the lower ridership you have. You can squeeze a little bit out of it, and we did that last year. I suspect we will do it again in fiscal 25, but it's not a huge revenue driver. Service levels we've talked about. That really equates specifically to how many employees you have. So financial management. We recognize at Metro that we have to put our own savings on the table. If we're going to ask anybody else for money, we have to make sure that we're running a really, really aggressive operation to find cost savings. So I'll come back to that in a second. So coming with that are internal efficiencies, and then preventive maintenance, and we'll talk about that in a minute, as well as federal revenue recovery. Should the federal government actually bring everybody back to work, that would certainly increase our revenue. However, we are several days away from a government shutdown, in which instead of bringing people back to work, people won't be allowed to work. So that's not going to be good for Metro's revenue. But aggressive management actions focus on savings. So we have a task force at Metro looking at our internal operations and trying to find places that we can save money. And you can see the impact of management action since FY 18 to save money. Cumulatively, we've saved about $358 million from where we were through various, there's in the board presentation tomorrow, there are about 5 slides that go into great detail about all these different management actions that are being taken or proposed for the board to consider. But consolidating our call centers is one of them. We're actually reducing the number of vehicles in our fleet. We're selling off about 5% of our vehicles per year for the next several years. All those kinds of things to try to at least tighten our belts as much as we can and run as lean an operation as we can within the constraints of our labor negotiations and our collective bargaining agreement. And that, as I mentioned, is a bit of a challenge. So scenarios. The biggest lever that we have is because of the Infrastructure Act last year, there is some new money coming into transit systems for maintenance, for preventive maintenance. Now, I need to be very, very clear because we have a unfortunate legacy in Metro of using preventive maintenance money for purposes other than preventive maintenance, and that gets you into the situation we had between about 2009 and 2018, which was fires, which was derailments, which was a system that was not in good shape. The region came together at that time, and they funded capital funding for Metro to the tune of $500 million a year, and we have used it. We have an incredibly good capital delivery team at Metro. We have been delivering projects on time and on budget, and we have virtually rebuilt the system from a track perspective, from an electrical perspective, from a tunnel perspective. This is some of the best track. This is some of the best subway that exists in the United States and in the world. And we're very, very proud of that. So when I talk about utilizing preventive maintenance in this scenario, we are not going back to those days. The amount of money we're talking about that's come in is new money that we were planning to use to accelerate components of our capital plan. However, it could be repurposed on a 1-year or 2-year basis to help us get through this fiscal cliff. And if we do that, management's presenting us with 3 scenarios. The first scenario is how much preventive maintenance usually is showing up in our operating budget. Scenario B is adding some to that, and scenario C is adding even more to that, ranging from an extra 139 million up to 285 million. And what it does is, the number that was 750 is now 650 because of management actions. So Metro itself is going to propose $100 million in savings internally. That gets our deficit to 650. If we start applying capital money for future projects into this operating budget for FY25, we can bring the deficit ultimately down to 365 million. Still a lot of money, but less than it was, less than where we started from. And that's really outside of making decisions on labor and service. That's about what Metro can do on its own. The rest of that, the region's gonna have to come up with. I mentioned that there's a 3% cap on operating subsidy. So in 2017, as part of our strategic plan, management recommended and the board approved an annual jurisdictional operating contribution growth at 3%. And to be fair, it wasn't as if Metro on its own necessarily thought that was exactly the way to go, but that's what our jurisdictional partners wanted to do. And when you're a compact organization like we are, we do what our partners want us to do. So in 2018, the historic dedicated capital funding for state of good repair was funded. And in Maryland and Virginia, the money that we got is conditioned on a 3% cap on annual operating budget subsidy increases. Actually, the District of Columbia does not have this cap in place. However, because we have a formula and the costs are shared between the system, the jurisdictions, effectively they do, because the other jurisdictions do. So this cap is in place. If we are to fill the 365, assuming that the Metro Board decides to use the full amount of preventive maintenance available to us, we're going to have to lift that cap. It's going to take legislative action in Maryland and Virginia to lift that cap, at least on a temporary basis, to allow whoever is willing to fund Metro, whether that's entirely the local governments or the state government or some combination thereof, to fill that gap. Or else we will be in the service reduction scenario, about 40% that we talked about. A little bit less because we're closing that gap some, but still a service reduction scenario. So we definitely have our work cut out for us on a timeline. The general manager will propose a budget to the Metro Board in December. In January, we will likely be issuing layoff notices to staff. We will institute a hiring freeze. We have to do a Title VI analysis and public process. So this is a really important point that almost nobody understands. If Metro is to reduce service, we cannot simply say we're going to just reduce service. Okay, we have to reduce service by 40%, 40% fewer trains. No, we have to go through a Title VI equity analysis to do that. And any new service plan that we come up with cannot have a disparate impact on low-income riders. What does that mean for us in Virginia? We have a lower share of low-income riders. It means that the brunt of service cuts will come to Virginia. It will be the Silver Line, probably the Red Line, where you just look at income and where service is, that's probably what will bear the brunt of those cuts, and that includes the airport. So that's problematic for us, and that's why we want to try to avoid that scenario. Normally, the board would adopt a budget in the April timeframe, and so on and so forth, and we roll into the next fiscal year. So the next several months are going to be really important for figuring this problem out. We have an election in November. We don't know what control of the Virginia General Assembly will be. I can certainly tell you that we've had many, many conversations with all of our partners. I personally drove to Richmond on Monday and met with Secretary Miller, along with Paul Smedberg, who's our board chair. We're the 2 Virginia board members, and had a 2-hour discussion with Secretary Miller about this. It's not the first one that we've had. There's a working group at the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission. There's a working group at the Council of Governments on both the elected official and the chief administrative officer level. So there's a lot of people thinking about all this. At this point, there's not necessarily a lot of solutions, but what Metro's trying to do is present a way to get through the next year or two until we can come up with what is probably a region-wide long-term solution, potentially a dedicated revenue source. Doesn't necessarily have to be a new revenue source, but a dedicated revenue source with enhanced revenue to get us through what we need long-term. Because what will happen is not only is the operating budget going to run into trouble, but we've spent all the $500 million we're getting, inflation plus debt service. So in a couple of years, because of all the projects we've undertaken, all the dedicated capital money we'll be getting will be going toward paying debt service on those projects. So we're going to have a capital issue as well, and by using more preventive maintenance money, we're going to accelerate the capital issue and run into this problem at the same time. So that's the challenge in front of us. We're going to need everybody's help in the region to solve it. Let me just, for a real quick minute, take a bit of a sidebar just on a few things going on here at Dulles Airport, because Dulles has seen more growth than any other international gateway in the United States in 2023. A lot of you know that. And we do think that Metro had something to do with that, particularly for international service and international travelers. It makes it a more attractive destination, and so you've had several new airlines and more flights. We have some future service growth coming. Kuwait kind of getting back to where we were as a Middle East hub here. Zurich and then Munich being upgauged to the A380 is going to be exciting. But several of those stakeholders has talked specifically about Metro. In Loudoun County, we adopted a new airport impact overlay district in January of this year, which protects Dulles from residential encroachment. It prohibits residential growth in the 65 plus LDN area. We've had that in place since the 90s, but things changed over the years. Overflight patterns changed. The FAA's changed in terms of where they're setting aircraft. And so we removed at least 1,500 housing units from being built in high impact noise areas. And we remain engaged in conversations, or trying to be engaged in conversations with the FAA over specific flight pattern issues. But we also strengthen protections or requirements for purchaser notifications to help at least let folks know when they're moving here, although it may be obvious, that they're moving in next to an airport. And that's what we can control at the county level. Obviously, you're familiar with the solar projects here, but that did require approval by the Board of Supervisors, and we were engaged in a land use process on that. And then I'll end with making a pitch for one of my real priority projects, should I be fortunate enough to continue serving on the Board of Supervisors, and that is the Route 50 Northern Collector Road. So we're planning for a new roadway to connect Route 50 to Route 28 between Tall Cedars and Air and Space Parkway, the western side of that interchange at 28, which has a lot of capacity built into it. South of Dulles Airport, the 50 corridor between Loudoun County and Fairfax County is a mess. It has something like 14 traffic signals, and there are no plans in Fairfax County to upgrade that to a signal-free environment like we have on the Loudoun side. So what we've proposed is a road that would essentially go up and with the cooperation and support of the Airports Authority, sort of hug the southern boundary of the airport and then come up and over into Air and Space Parkway. The county recently updated our traffic model on this. It shows that without this, we will be in a gridlock situation in about 10 or 15 years. We already have a level of service F during peak periods on Route 50. So this is a really, really important project. It's one that we're working with MWA on, and one that we're working with Fairfax County on, and this is kind of the visual. Over the past year or so, Loudoun County staff and our consultants have been working really closely with the Airports Authority to address their specific comments on right-of-way here, and we've also been working to address concerns about access for aircraft to Uvar. So this is a difficult project. It will take a long time to get done. It will be expensive, because all these things are, but it really unlocks the potential of this area, I believe. and gets us out of kind of a really cluttered place on Route 50 in Fairfax County, in an interchange of 28, which is an old style cloverleaf weave type of interchange that just creates conflict and accidents all the time. So that's one of my priorities and one of the things that we're working on with the airport and the business community and so on. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I will pause, but I'm happy to take questions.
Any questions at this time?
That was a great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Jeff?
Can I ask about the $2 weekend fare?
Yes.
Is that indefinite, or is that just an experiment?
No, I mean, it's
It's too good to believe. I went all the way down to Union Station back this weekend for $4.
You did?
I think you're giving it away.
No, it is permanent. I mean, it's the extent our fares we look at every year. So it's like a budget. It's like your tax rate. You know, it's something. It's our version of that where Metro Board sets fare policy once a year. And so, but we did it with the intention of keeping it because what we're really trying to do is get people on the system. And if you think about, especially in the weekend, long trips, we see some long trips, and we want to try to incentivize those long trips. But if you have a family, and we're charging our max fare, which is $6 right now, and you've got 4 kids, then it's $24 each way to take your family to DC, and $24 back. Well, that's $50. For $50, you could pay tolls and you could park downtown. On the weekends, it's $15, and you're not going to use Metro. So we really thought a lot about that and kind of what the use case is for Metro on the weekends. And that's really why we went to the $2 fare. You know, it has been successful. We've seen some, you know, increases in ridership on the weekends, as I said, and I'd like to keep it.
Good. Other questions? Rob?
Since you've got this map up, is this Collector Road north of Route 50 where you're showing it?
Yes.
So is it within Airport Authority property or?
Oh, a lot of it is, yes.
Okay.
Which is why I said we need the cooperation and coordination with MWA in order to be able to do this.
So MWA has a master plan meeting coming up on October the 11th. I think it's here, David, is that correct?
Correct.
So I don't know what time, 6 o'clock, I think.
Yes.
But everybody should come and understand, because this is the first time I'm seeing this, okay? And I support that very much. Going to the WMATA problem, one area I've gone to over 100 WMATA board meetings and actually 180 MWA meetings since 2008. And the one thing that has not happened is that fare increases have been very minimal. And I estimated about 1% a year in the decade since I've been going. These days I watch online, so I don't go to board meetings. Obviously, there are constraints on revenue growth, but for instance, you did away with the peak fare during rush hours, and back in about 2018, 2019, I suggested to NBTC that in fact, Virginia could have as a source of revenue for its capital projects. That if the max fare then was $6, that if you made it between 7 and 9 in the morning, 4 and 6 in the evening, $9, a 50% increase, then use that revenue to help defray your operating and capital cost needs. And so I guess my point is that the present study, orange, blue, silver, is premised on old information regarding demand. But what I'm saying is by increasing the peak period fares, you can spread out the demand. Now, work days are much more flexible than they used to be. And so I would ask that the WMATA board gives consideration.
Yeah, so the peak, as I mentioned, so peak period isn't what it used to be. There still is a rush hour, there still is peak, but Monday through Friday, it's nominal. So we got rid of having a peak and an off peak because it doesn't really exist the way that we used to. However, what we did was the peak essentially the peak now, off-peak is the same as peak in terms of what we're charging. So certain riders did get a significant fare increase when they were riding off-peak, particularly riders riding longer distances. We had to sort of offset this, and so there was the fare changes that Metro made last year were revenue positive by about $7 million. But as I mentioned, there's an elasticity issue. Let's just say we took the max fare and we took it from $6 to $9. You lose so many riders by doing that it offsets the increased revenue that you get. And so there's a model that's actually a federal model that we use to look at that. And when you really get into the nitty gritty of those numbers, it doesn't generate much revenue. And I will say, our goal was to try to get more people to use Metro and get back on the system, because ultimately, if you can get them using regularly, they're going to start using it off-peak, you're going to start using it for some other activities and so on, and that's ultimately good for us. But we are going to do a check back on, we actually made pretty significant fare changes last year. We're going to do a check back on all of it and see how it's performing as we roll into this week.
All right, one last question, Dave. You're not gonna mess with my senior citizen guy, right?
No, seniors are still there, and we actually have made it easier to get a senior card now. So, and that was really the model for the low income fare program as well. Yep.
And still half there.
Yes, it is half. Yep.
All right.
Yep.
All right, thank you.
All right, thank you.